who you can see with a lovely backdrop of horses. We'll both be monitoring the chat for Jodi, who's our speaker today. So if you have any questions, feel free to put them in there during the talk, and then we'll let Jodi know that you have some questions. And I'm excited for today's talk. I'm actually a veterinarian, so I don't know a ton about pasture management, but thankfully we have experts at Cornell who do, including Jodi. So Jodi's actually, Jodi Putman is a field crop specialist with Cornell Cooperative Extension. And I think she's going to share a little bit more about her interests and her kind of specialties on the next slide. But she has a lot of experience evaluating pastures of all types. But she has a special interest in horses because she's a secret horse girl. But we're very excited to have Jodi with us today, and feel free to let us know in the chat if you have any questions, and take it away, Jodi.
All right, guys, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. Happy to see everyone. Like Lindsay said, I'm the field crop specialist with the Northwest New York Dairy, Livestock, and Field Crops team. It's an extension team that manages 9 counties. Trying to see if this will work. It's my first time giving a live presentation, so I apologize if we end up going back and forth a few times on some slides, but like I said, I'm the field crop specialist with the Northwest New York Dairy, Livestock, and Field Crops team. It's a Cornell Cooperative Extension partnership between Cornell University and the CCE associations in 9 counties. My area of interest is in agronomy, agroecosystems, forage quality, nutrient management, soil health, and fertility. Among our team, we have several different types of specialists. We have 2 dairy specialists, a livestock and small farm specialist, who also focuses on grazing and pastures with me, 2 field crop specialists, 2 farm business management specialists, and a precision ag specialist. So you can find our information on the team website listed right here. So when I was asked to give the presentation on pasture management, I thought, well, this would be a great introduction to pasture ecology. The horse farm manager who understands plant, soil, and animal ecology is prepared to be an excellent pasture manager to understand how to adapt to changes in weather and interpret how research and farmer experience from other areas apply to their farm. So what is ecology? Ecology is the interrelationships of sunlight, grasses, legumes, weeds, soils, and grazing animals with their environment. And categories that can be included in that would be non-living components, plants that capture solar energy, herbivores, carnivore consumers, and decomposers, which we will dive into. So why do we care about pasture ecology? Each plant, animal, bacteria, protozoa, and fungus has its niche or place in its ecosystem. Some plants are better adapted to their environment than others. Ecosystems have a huge impact on pasture quality, and by understanding ecology, we can better implement management techniques. So what influences pasture ecology? We have energy, water and temperature, your pasture site, your space available for pasture, competition, grazing habits, plant anatomy, soil characteristics, decomposers, and pests. So what do I mean by energy? Well, energy runs the show. Free energy in the form of sunlight. So we manage pastures to maximize sunlight. We want to increase leaf and surface area. We want to increase size of leaves and increase length of growing season. So how do we do that? So based on the volume of plants within that pasture or space given and the duration of the growing season and the amount of area of a plant, area of the leaf on the plant, it basically enables the plant to capture sunlight. And so energy through sunlight is the single most important influence on pasture yield. Light collection is influenced by forage species, leaf angle, canopy density, leaf aging, and the availability of water and nutrients in the soil. And so as you may know, plants are the primary producers in the pasture ecosystem. They intercept light through photosynthesis, as you see here in this picture, and using its energy to fix carbon dioxide and water to make carbohydrates, some of which is also converted to other plant components. We also know that legume plants like clovers and alfalfa use rhizobia bacteria and root nodules to fix their own nitrogen from air that is used by the plant to make proteins. Plants take up mineral nutrients from the soil to make enzymes, coenzymes, DNA, RNA, and cell structures within the plant. And so these minerals are used for similar purposes in livestock that eat and digest the plants. And so what happens at night? So photosynthesis occurs during the day, and we also have respiration. So plants use respiration to maintain life and to grow. Respiration is the conversion of carbohydrates to carbon dioxide and water to release energy needed to perform metabolic functions. The release of carbon dioxide and water by plants is part of the global carbon and water cycles. So during the day, both photosynthesis and respiration occurs, with photosynthesis dominating, and there's a net increase of carbohydrates that build up in the crop. So what happens at night is that photosynthesis kind of dies off, respiration continues, and there's a net loss of carbohydrates in the plant. This can be seen in the cycle of sugar in plant leaves. The sugar content in a leaf is lowest at sunrise. So during the day, sugar content increases in the plant and can be used for leaf and root growth and are stored as reserves for energy. So it helps create food for the plant to continue its life cycle and grow and give us those different stages of growth that we need for quality and yield on our pastures. So this picture is actually a picture of my dad and my grandfather. I grew up on a farm and we make hay. And so some people actually, based on that type of cycle, will just determine when to harvest their hay, earlier or later in the day based on the sugar content and carbohydrate buildup that they need. As some of you may know, horses, some have specific diets where they need lower sugar content, and so that can also affect and influence when you decide to harvest. So that's just a nice picture there. So after sunset, respiration uses up leaf sugar, bringing it back to a low point in the morning. Both photosynthesis and respiration are affected by air temperature, with different plant species having different responses to temperature. Oops. So this is just a quick video to kind of go through photosynthesis, and there's different plants with photosynthesis cycles, and this kind of explains it for us.
Photosynthesis is the process by which Photosynthesis is the process by which.
All right, we'll give it one more shot.
Photosynthesis is the process by which plants capture the energy of the sun to make carbohydrates. But there are minor variations in how plants do this, depending on the environment in which the plant lives. In this tutorial, we'll look at the differences between the three types of photosynthesis, C3, C4, and CAM. Most plants, around 85% or so, carry out C3 photosynthesis. As we will see, the name C3 has to do with the type of carbon molecule produced during the process. C3 photosynthesis occurs in the mesophyll cells of the C3 plant, which are located just under the surface of the leaves and other tissues. Let's take a quick look at how photosynthesis occurs in these cells. During C3 photosynthesis, CO2 is taken up and transported directly to the Kelvin cycle, where it's fixed into a 3-carbon molecule, thus the name C3. If the stomata are open, CO2 moves in and oxygen moves out of the cell. But under hot or dry conditions, when the stomata are closed, oxygen accumulates, which inhibits the amount of C3 that can be made. Some plants have evolved an adaptation that allows them to be successful in hot, dry conditions. These plants carry out C4 photosynthesis instead of C3 photosynthesis. During C4 photosynthesis, CO2 moves into the mesophyll cell and is immediately fixed into a 4-carbon molecule, thus the name C4 photosynthesis. But the anatomy of a C4 plant is different from that of a C3 plant. A somewhat simplified version of this process is shown here. In a C4 leaf, chloroplasts are located in mesophyll cells. They are also located in bundled sheath cells, which surround the leaf vein. CO2 moves from the mesophyll cells into the bundled sheath cells, where the Calvin cycle occurs. This shields the plant from the oxygen buildup that would otherwise occur when the stomata are closed during dry conditions. A second way of addressing the problem of oxygen is to change the timing of photosynthesis. This is called CAM photosynthesis, and in many ways it's similar to C4 photosynthesis, except that the timing of the process changes. During CAM photosynthesis, CO2 is taken up during the night when the stomata are open and is fixed into a 4-carbon molecule. It's then stored until daylight as an intermediate molecule, which gives the CAM cycle its name. This adaptation allows photosynthesis to occur in drier climates than in both C3 and C4 photosynthesis. A great example of a CAM plant is the cactus. Let's do a quick review. During C3 photosynthesis, CO2 is taken up and transported directly to the Calvin cycle. The C4 pathway alters the location of photosynthesis, and the CAM pathway changes the timing. Both of these adaptations allow some plants to survive in environments that are less than ideal for the typical C3 plant.
All right. I hope you guys heard all of that. Sorry, I didn't have speakers set up. So as you can see, based on photosynthesis, if we have competition for sunlight, when another plant shades its neighbor, the photosynthesis rate of that declines. And so that can decrease the ability for the plant to grow on a regular basis. And so usually competition for sunlight happens in early growth in the spring and then regrowth after grazing and cutting.
Hey, Jodi.
Yeah.
This is Lindsay. We have a question. What are, of the plants in the Northeast and equine pastures, are most of those C3 plants?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay.
Full season grasses. Yep. Okay. So we have a competitive advantage where sunlight is not like a soil nutrient. It must be used instantaneously. And once it's gone forever. And so the position of leaves gives plants a competitive edge. And so different species in your pasture, whether they're grasses, legumes, weeds, shrubs, have different leaf arrangements. And this is a nice diagram to kind of show you different leaf arrangements. And this enables a plant to capture and maximize its ability to capture sunlight and help with the photosynthesis process. So water. Rainfall is the primary water source for pastures. Irregular rainfall can lead to deficiencies or excessive soil water, such as runoff, soil erosion. Too much is not good. It's a direct effect on plant productivity and persistence. Drought. So just like having too much water, if you don't have enough water, you can decrease the ability for the plant to take up nutrients. Nutrients applied as fertilizer or that eventually are broken down by soil microorganisms always end up as a water-soluble nutrient. So they end up in the water source that can be taken up through the roots by the plant to help with growth. Plant leaf area decreases. That just comes with, drought conditions where the plant leaf kind of shrivels up. It closes the stomata so that it doesn't lose any kind of energy. root growth increases, where you actually see the root profile go deeper. It's looking deeper for water sources. It limits the ability also for legumes to fix nitrogen, and your carbohydrate storage supply decreases. Nutrient levels usually end up being highest at the soil surface in drought conditions. In saturated conditions where soils are too wet, it's poor and it slows the plant growth. So water fills soil pockets, it's excluding oxygen needed by plant roots. You can end up with fungal root diseases, disease organisms, and that can thrive and also damage roots. And typically saturated conditions take a longer time to recover, and you need to postpone your grazing after saturated conditions because obviously you'll tear up your pasture and create a lot of damage. And so thinking about how the weather and temperature and climate can affect your pasture, this was a nice article. This is actually a published journal article that you can find at the link here below, Climate Change and Livestock, the Impact, Adaptation, and Mitigation. And so basically what I just wanted to show here is that as temperature increases, how it affects your forages. So you can have changes in herbage growth. You can decrease the forage quality, some positive effects, partial stomata closures, reduce transpiration. You can improve water efficiency. But really, as your temperatures increase, and we're seeing this with climatic changes, as we see different weed species actually move from the south further north because it's getting warmer. So that's going to affect the seasonal patterns of the types of grasses and species that we use for our forages for our livestock. So this is a nice figure here when you're looking for specific species for forage growth. This is a seasonal growth and availability of common forage species. And so common grasses found on pastures, orchard grass, tall fescue, your clovers, perennial ryegrass. And here you can see in this, April through June, you have a flush, of decent growth. Usually towards the end of June and July and August, when we have our hotter temperatures here in the Northeast, that's kind of when growth and reproduction slow down because of hotter temperatures, and then they kind of ramp back up here as the temperatures cool. And so this is a nice picture, and you can also go down through here of the forage species and kind of look at what would be good to pair with if you wanted a mixed stand. Pasture site is another huge factor when you're deciding where and what you want to plant. Forage crops cannot escape the location where they're grown. Locations influence and affect the composition and growth, and so important factors to consider when you're trying to map out where you want to place your pastures and how you want a rotation to be in place. You want to look at elevation, you want to look at your soil type, your drainage, your slope, and exposure. All of those are things that can influence the rate and productivity and persistence of your pasture. And so what I really like about this diagram is that rotational grazing is huge. This does show cattle in the paddock. This is an example of rotating cattle, but same concept for horses or any other livestock that you have. Based on the number of paddocks you can put out on your property, you can see here that, you can start the season in one section, and, so you have early season, you can start it. And that might be where you have your earlier maturing species on your pasture that get up and get going. And then as you get into your mid-season, you might have this pasture planted to a mixture of species that kind of flow with the growth patterns and the seasonal changes. Just so that you can have optimal productivity in each pasture and that you're not overgrazing and damaging and reducing your yield opportunities on your pasture. So I really like to promote the rotational grazing if you can. If not, there are other practices you can put into place that'll help, such as timing, maybe limit the amount of time that your livestock is on that pasture. As you know, if you do overgraze, your space and availability within the pastures, if you end up with bare spaces, that really allows for growth of unwanted species. And as space becomes limited, so does moisture, light, nutrients, and all of the other stuff needed for growth for an optimum pasture. So competition. All organisms grow and reproduce best when they live in an environment that provides ideal levels of all their needed resources, such as temperature, water, nutrients, heat, protection from predators and parasites. If the availability of a resource falls below a critical value, the health and productivity of an organism decreases. So it's very similar to the law of diminishing returns. So for example, your clover plants need a pH of 6.0. And soil tests for your nutrients such as phosphorus and potassium need to be high and in the optimum range when you get those results back, or their health and productivity decrease significantly. So they kind of all go hand in hand. You need optimal fertility and pH so that you can get things to grow collectively together. If another plant, like let's say tall fescue, is more tolerant of a lower pH or medium soil test, like potassium, it'll have a competitive advantage and will increase in the stand at the expense of the clover. So mixed stands do kind of flush each other out. Some, as I mentioned before, some species are more tolerant of other characteristics than others. And so that's where, you know, as the stand ages, you'll see some of those more tolerable species outlast some of the other ones that aren't so tolerant of some of these factors. Looking at temperature as a resource, cool season grasses have a lower critical temperature near 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So when average daily temperatures are below that, their growth rate is limited by the temperature. Likewise, cool season grasses have an upper critical temperature near 70 degrees. So as daily mean temperatures increase from 70 to 90, growth of cool season grasses decrease near the maximum at 70 degrees to 0 at 90 degrees. So pretty much that's saying that, you know, 50 to 70 degrees is that optimal range for growth and productivity of cool season grasses. If you get much above 70 degrees, then that's when the plant's going to start shutting down so that it can help reserve its carbohydrates and nutrients for productivity when the temperature drops back down below that degrees. If a warm season grass is in the stand, its growth rate grows slow from 70 to near a maximum at 90. So this is one reason Bermuda grass or like crabgrass can be dominant in a pasture in August, but your tall fescue is dominant on October, temperature based. So just another example of the law of diminishing returns here. This is a nice graph just to kind of give you an idea of, you know, inputs versus outputs and your return on investment. So let's say that your input is going to be nitrogen on your pasture or your hay stand, and that your output here is going to be your yield and productivity. The point of maximum yield is, we'll say 100 pounds of nitrogen per acre, where you get the most yield for your input. Beyond this, you get less yield due to the negative returns caused by over-fertilization of the soil. You're spending more than what you're getting in return. And so that's pretty much what this graph is showing you, is that, you know, most productive here, as you provide the fertility and the moisture and the correct management practices, you're going to get, you know, your biggest bang for your buck. And then there is a certain point to where you can actually overdo it and you're actually going to harm it. So what makes a plant a successful competitor? It needs to quickly draw on the limited factors, grow more roots and leaves, and adapt to several environmental conditions. Competition can be in the form of water, nutrients, light, carbon dioxide, oxygen, environmental stressors, means of pollination, and seed dispersal. One second here. Yeah, so success of a single plant depends on how well its characteristics match the demands of the environment and allow it to cope with stresses as compared to neighboring plants. Increase the competitiveness of the desired species and or decrease the competitiveness of the undesirable species, given what you can manage. So grazing habits. Intensity and frequency can have a tremendous effect on competitive ability of many pasture plants. Pasture species vary greatly with their ability to tolerate grazing. Grazing horses. So more complex pastures with the types and number of animals on it, selective grazing, manure and urine, and traffic all influence productivity of a pasture. So traffic is a huge thing. Also manure. If you're overstocked on a pasture, obviously you're going to have tremendous traffic, which is going to beat up the pasture. And so there's going to be some more micromanaging that needs to happen to that pasture per season, year, month, you name it. You're just going to have to micromanage your pastures more. So horse pasture management, horses that have 24/7 access to pasture spend 60 to 70% of their time grazing. And horses are selective eaters. Just like humans, there are some types of foods that you like. Horses have favorites too. And they also are pattern grazers. I'm not sure if any of you have horses, but pay attention sometime. Just spend some time out there watching them graze from morning, give it a couple hours, and you'll see they kind of follow the same pattern morning to night. And with my horses, I can tell you where they're going to be at 5 o'clock at night. I can tell you where they're going to be at 1 o'clock most of the time. So they usually overgraze the tastiest grass, and that'll encourage bare patches, which will then lead to weedy areas. And another thing that you're going to have to manage. So management, things that we can manage are plant height, especially during leaf development and elongation. So grazing frequency we can manage, and the intensity. And then soil characteristics that we can manage would be our lime and pH, our fertility with your macronutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, calcium, magnesium, and your micros, manure, microorganisms, earthworms, nematodes, your decomposers. So let's talk about some of the soil characteristics that we can manage. Fertilization, so it starts with a soil test to determine lime and fertilizer needs for alfalfa or your grasses, mixed stands, you name it. It starts with a soil test. Fields being seeded to alfalfa or cool season grasses need to have a pH between 6.5 to 7.0, and lime needs to be applied 6 months to allow the lime to react with the soil and minimize herbicide carryover. And there are different starter fertilizer packages you can talk about with your co-ops that you use to purchase based on your soil test results, and different types of placement too. So this is a nice picture here of your nutrient availability based on your pH range. And so here you can see that a lot of your nutrients, macro and micro, fall within that pH range of 6.5 to 7.0. And so slightly acidic to neutral. Much beyond that, you're not going to have nutrient availability. And so I have seen soil tests come back to me where it's 5.7, 6.2, and there is liming that is needed. And most of the time, depending on the lab that you're working with, they will give you a recommendation at the bottom of the page. But this just gives you an idea of where you want your ranges to be for your nutrients and management when you get your soil test back.
Hey Jodi, this is Lindsay again. We have a question. Someone's wondering, where can they usually get a soil test done?
So you can work with your local extension co-op to get the materials needed. Most of the time your extension offices will have the boxes that you need. And they also can provide there are a lot of resources out there. You can get online and YouTube how to take a soil test. But most of the time, if you just have like a spade shovel and you can get the top 8 inches, mix it within a 5-gallon bucket when you go across the field, and then put it into the little container that the co-op or extension office gives you. Then you send it into the lab with the field details, and then you'll get the report back. Or you can pay a service to come out and do it depending on the acreage that needs to be soil sampled. Does that help answer the question?
Yes, thank you very much.
Do we have any other questions that we want to answer?
I think I just wanted to make sure everyone knew how to raise their hand virtually. If you go into the chat feature, there's a little hand, a blue hand symbol. So if you want to raise your hand, let us know, or you can type a question in the chat. Thanks.
Okay. So as you know, healthy soils lead to healthy pastures, and so various soils and their nutrient levels favor different plant species. Knowing general fertility requirements of various pasture plants has practical application. Soil organisms help reduce nitrogen loss through leaching and help release organic materials for better uptake of nutrients by the roots. Rhizobium bacteria nodulate legumes, the legume roots, and have a symbiotic relationship with plants. However, it requires certain nutrients and pH levels for nodulation and fixation of nitrogen to happen. Earthworms can improve pasture production by 25%. It's a neat fact here. They aerate and loosen the soil. They can incorporate dead pasture plants, break down manure quickly, and eat nematodes that could harm clover roots. They can move 20 to 30 tons of soil per acre per year. Side note, when you're thinking about fertility, if you use a urea fertilizer as your nitrogen source, you can cut earthworm numbers by half. So you would want to use an ammonium nitrate instead. It's the available form of nitrogen, so it's safer potentially for your earthworms. A soil below a pH of 5.6 is unfavorable, and there needs to be a lot of cover for earthworms to habitate that area. No bare soil. And then another thing a lot of people don't think about as far as an ecosystem are nematodes. Beneficial nematodes are important because they lead to rapid decay and incorporation of organic matter in soil. They help recycle nutrients. They feed on bacteria and fungi and soil protozoa. Pathogenic forms are kept in check by predatory nematodes in soils that are in good condition. And this is a very detailed picture of a nematode. And let me just tell you, they're microscopic. You're not going to be able to go out to a pasture and find a nematode. You can see earthworms, but you're not going to be able to see nematodes. So that's just a side note for you. So moving into management, weed management is huge. And this is probably the primary phone calls that I get about pastures and hay stands is on weed management. So a weed is a plant that grows where we do not want them to grow. And that usually occurs in pastures where there's overgrazing, there's a lot of traffic, where we end up with bare spots, and that enables a weed species to kind of move in. So when is a weed not a weed? When livestock eat them. Can weeds be toxic to animals within a pasture setting? Yes. So this is the Canadian Horse Journal. They have this nice chart here of plants in Canada that are toxic to horses. And we actually have several of these plants here in New York, Pennsylvania, the Northeast, we'll say. There are several. So Azalea clover, burdock, Johnson grass, nightshades, Jimson weed, cockleburr, barnyard, trying to think, poison hemlock. So yeah, you can just see here that we do have common species here in New York and the Northeast that are similar to Canada, and they are toxic to horses. So you do want to watch and be careful. So let's jump into clovers. Clovers, like alfalfa, have the potential to cause bloat in animals. So generally they are short-lived and less productive than alfalfa, and also in pastures with cool season grasses. However, they can be more tolerant of somewhat poorly drained and acidic soils. Seedings happen usually in April to early May and are usually mixed with grasses on pastures where the livestock are eventually transitioned to pure grass. And if oats are used, you want to reduce the seeding rate by 30%. That's just some kind of housekeeping. If you're going to go with a clover in a mixed stand for either hay or pasture. Some of your clover species, you have your red clover, which is a short-lived, relatively easy to establish perennial legume that grows on soils that are too wet or acidic for alfalfa. Usually they're disease resistant, so like your anthracnose. We have white clover, which is another short-lived perennial with some reseeding capabilities, ladino or regal or large white clover varieties that you can purchase. Pure stands of ladino and other white clovers are not recommended or well suited for a silage or hay because of their low growing leafy growth habitat. They're good for livestock pastures and do well in rainy years. Shallow root system, and they lack sufficient drought tolerance to survive a dry spell. So again, your clovers are a decent species to use in a mixture with other grasses. Your all-site clover is a short-lived perennial. It's susceptible to same diseases as your red and white clovers, and growth is intermediate to the others. And then we also have a sweet clover, not as common. Your two common pasture clovers would be your red and your white, and a lot of people mix the all-site clover up. And just to give you an example here, if you guys, since we're trying to keep it interactive, and I know this is my first time using a live presentation, so this was something where we could raise our hands, but you can tell me which one's a white clover, red, and all-site clover. So a lot of people mix up white clover with all-site clover because they look very similar. However, once you get to the flower, you can see the difference here. And also you can look at the leaves, and usually the white clovers have that white ring on it, whereas your all-site clover does not. So all-site clover, what to be aware of if you notice issues with your horses. So one of the first signs of possible consumption of all-site clover is slobbers or excessive drooling. For some reason in 2019, we had a lot of phone calls related to some toxicity issues in their horses. And when we made the pasture visits, the only thing that we could actually come up with as far as a recommendation was that there was a large consumption of all-site clover. And so other signs to look for that there's been ingestion of all-site clover is that it's known to cause two syndromes. You have photosensitivity, and then the other severe symptom would be a big liver syndrome. So it causes a liver toxicity. And although the toxicity has been described for 70 years, the actual toxin is unknown. Horses show photosensitivity with short-term exposure, while the liver damage and enlargement of the liver is usually associated with long-term exposure. This problem has occurred mainly in horses and occasionally in cattle. There's also a potential for nitrate poisoning with all-site clover. I haven't really heard of much of an issue there. It's more of the liver enlargement toxicity problem and the photosensitivity with the horses. The more common and acute lesions related to the all-site clover are the photosensitivity. So you'll see the reddening of the skin under the influence of the sunlight, followed by either superficial or deep drying of the skin, where you can see here in this other photo, inflamed areas. You will have to call a vet out for this, and they'll have to put them on some stuff. So those are some questions that I got here this past year in 2019 that kind of threw me off because I'm not a vet, but you know, they want to know what's harming their horses, as would I. And it's a scary thing when you see something like this happening to your horse. So weeds can be a nuisance. They're common weeds, they can be invasive weeds, they can be noxious. And weeds can cause significant profitability losses due to their competitive and invasive characteristics. Weeds, they can be grasses, they can be grass-like plants, they can be forbs, so flowering broadleaf plants, legumes, trees, vines, shrubs, annuals, biennials, and perennials. They can spread by birds and animals, wind, water, humans, accidentally or intentionally. I don't know if you guys have had issues with your horses getting some of the burdock in their mane, but I would probably just want to walk away if I saw my horse looking like that. So weeds can take advantage of opportunity. They're very competitive for sunlight. As I mentioned, the leaf arrangement, some of these weed species can be very competitive with their leaf arrangement where none of the leaves will ever overlap each other. So kind of like that rosette formation. Soil disturbances, moisture changes, soil chemical changes with the pH and nutrient availability, they can withstand harsher conditions versus the intended species that you want to grow. So control strategies would be good management, mechanical, chemical with herbicides, or biological. Mechanical would be mowing, brush hogging routinely with your pastures. If you can, most of the time, good management mechanically, if you can get in there and mow it, it can usually prevent a lot of these weed species from habitating the area. If not, and you let it get older and you just kind of do your seasonal thing where you throw the horses on or your livestock on the pasture, let them graze it, beat it up, then you're looking at more expensive management techniques like herbicides. And then that can kind of get tricky too, because herbicide application will depend on the age of the weed, the growing conditions, the weather conditions, and your options are really limited. One point being that you're primarily targeting your broadleaves in a pasture, and that a broad spectrum herbicide application in pastures is not very common. You can target broadleaves and grasses at the same time per se, or you can't. Re-entry grazing interval is another thing that you would definitely want to keep in mind when you're using a herbicide. You'll want to read the label. I can't stress that enough, that based on the weed species that you're trying to control, you're definitely going to want to read the label so you get the right rate. You make sure that it is registered for that use in that state, and that you also have that re-entry period. Some windows can certainly be quite large for those applications, and so that might limit you in wanting to use a herbicide application on your pasture, because you wouldn't be able to put the animals back on it in the window that you want them to be back on it. Other options would be biological. So maybe you can adopt a goat. You can host specific insects, specific diseases. You can target grazing, fall pasture. There are several different things that you can do here to help control your pest measures on your pasture. So with that being said, we will dive in here to some of the cool season grasses that we can use for hay and pasture here in the Northeast. And this just gives you a nice picture here that primarily cool season grasses can be grown in this Northeast region, to where you have this like transitional zone kind of down in the mid-Atlantic, and then you have warm season grasses down south. So this is just a nice picture that I wanted to share with you. When you're going to identify grasses, a lot of your diagnostic keys will show specific things to help you identify what grass that is. If you're out there on your pasture and trying to say, is this orchard grass? Is this reed canary grass? These are some of the diagnostic keys that we use. So you'll be looking for auricles, ligules, your blade, your collar region, your sheath. And so that just kind of is a nice display for you. So cool season grasses are perennial, tall growing grasses that play an important role in New York agriculture and Northeast agriculture as feed for livestock when grown alone or in mixtures with legumes, and for soil and water conservation. Some species and varieties that we can look at would be orchard grass. Orchard grass is a moderately hardy, tall-growing, high-yielding bunch grass variety. It attains more summer growth than others under intensive cutting management. So this is another thing that could also withstand intense grazing. If it can withstand the intense cutting management, if you're growing this for hay. It persists well with alfalfa, so that would be a good mix with a legume. In general, early maturing varieties are suitable for pure grass, hay or silage, or with legumes for pasture. You do not want to use in mixtures with legumes for hay or silage. Sorry about that. And then you can also have a medium to late maturing variety do well with combined legumes, hay, silage, or pasture. Late maturing for alfalfa, mixtures for hay or silage. Brome grass. Smooth brome grass is a leafy, late maturing sod forming grass that spreads by underground rhizomes and is rapidly propagated by seed. It's good for silage, hay, or pasture, alone or in mixtures with alfalfa or clovers. Prairie grass is a tall growing brome grass. It does not have rhizomes and producing flower heads in every regrowth, especially in the fall. Herbage and immature seed heads are palatable for livestock. And the Machua is the only variety available in the United States and persists best if managed like alfalfa. And more research is needed on performance of that variety. So Timothy is a hay-type forage grass with relatively few basal leaves below the cutting height. It is easily weakened by frequent cutting or grazing. So this would be a grass in a mixed stand that would not be as tolerant to the cutting or grazing intensity of your livestock, but it's decent for mixtures to mix it up. And it's a good pasture mixture. Again, these pictures show you, the seed, the head, the ligule and auricles, and the type of root growth, which is all diagnostic characteristics when you're trying to identify grasses that you're looking at. Reed Canarygrass is a cool season forage grass that does best in moist, cool climates. It prefers fertile, moist, and swampy soils and is especially well suited for areas along waterways that frequently overflow. So this grass is really good for wet areas. So if your pasture or your hay field is really wet and there's no way that you can incorporate any kind of drainage, this would probably be the better grass to go with. Tall fescue, it's another common grass. It's deep-rooted, long-lived, sod-forming grass that spreads by short underground stems. Low-quality tall fescue forage, which can result in poor animal performance. So fescue would probably be best in a mix of like your orchard grass or your timothy. It's suggested that new seedings be made with endophyte-free or friendly endophyte varieties. Just a key point that if you are a farm with pregnant mares, you're not going to want to use fescue. I would probably just steer clear in general from it because of the endophyte can cause abortions in mares. So I would just prefer to recommend steering clear of it if you are an operating facility with brood mares. Perennial ryegrass varieties can differ in maturity by over 2 weeks. Perennial ryegrass is a highly palatable bunch grass with no creeping growth habit. It normally is considered to be less winter hardy and slightly more digestible than other forage grasses, such as timothy and orchard grass, but newer varieties appear to survive satisfactorily, especially when grown in mixtures with legumes. Festulium is a cross between fescue and perennial ryegrass, and so this just kind of shows you the difference between your tall fescue type versus your festulium, which is a cross. Again, you'll want to be careful of this depending on the type of operation that you have, pregnant mares. So that kind of pretty much wraps up what I had to present on as far as cool season grasses for pastures or hay stands. In general, I can take any questions right now if anybody has a question.
Thanks, Jodi. So yeah, like she said, if anyone has a question, feel free to either you could raise your hand or type it in the chat, or if you want, you could unmute yourself, which is in the lower left-hand corner. So Jeff has a question. Do you recommend spring overseeding for pastures?
Yeah, so you can broadcast seed. It's not as effective for establishment, but if you're trying to kind of fill in the bare patches in your pastures, yes, you can do that. And typically right now is a perfect time to go ahead and do your broadcast application. on pastures. So I just wanted to make reference to some of these resources that I like to use. The horse pasture management book right here was just published here in 2019. I was able to purchase it here through Extension. It's a great resource. It has a whole bunch of information and different chapters on it. So I highly recommend if you guys are managing a horse operation to make the investment and purchase this book. It'll give you a great wealth of knowledge. The other thing too is that, weeds are problematic on pastures and in hay fields. And so I used Weeds of the Northeast a lot when I'm out in the field trying to remember what weed that was. It's a good reference book for weeds. And they also have the diagnostic keys in the back.
We have a few more questions. Do you recommend cover crops like oats? And if you do that for seeding a new pasture, do you reduce the amount of your other seed mix?
Yeah, so oats are a decent cover crop. It's commonly used. And if you are going to mix it, yeah, you will reduce your seeding rate depending on what you're mixing it with. There are a lot of different aspects that I could have gone with this presentation. And so if seeding rates and mixtures and establishment is something, you guys want to learn more about, I'd be more than happy to create other presentations with very specific information about seeding types, fertility, things like that.
And maybe they could also email you with some questions. So a couple more questions. Someone asked what grass is best for performance horses? Maybe they just mean high energy grasses.
Right, yeah, so really grasses in general, they're a great forage. A lot of people that I know, even the racetrack, they actually prefer alfalfa if you're doing a lot of, work with your horses. So if you could actually get a cross between, an alfalfa Timothy, alfalfa orchard grass, having that alfalfa in there with the added protein and energy will really help. In general, I like orchard grass and Timothy if you're just looking for a straight grass. And like I said, you can work with different labs as far as testing the quality of your hay and your, pasture species to get a nutrient value out of that to see if you need to supplement more or if you're getting what you need out of your pasture.
And then someone is asking how to eliminate buttercups in their pasture.
I actually got this question earlier. So buttercups are hard to manage depending on the stand age of that pasture. You might just want to look at a complete renovation. Buttercups are toxic to horses. So yeah, given it just really depends on the scenario. You kind of have to go through your checklist of depending on how old it is, how much you have percentage wise, what kind of investment do you want to make? Do you want to totally renovate? You could probably manage it with a herbicide application. Again, you'll have to look at that re-entry interval for grazing on the pasture, but definitely something you want to manage up front because it's not healthy for horses.
Great. And then someone else is asking, how long after fertilizing a pasture do you typically allow grazing?
Yeah, that's a great question. So depending on the fertilizer, like if you're using granular fertilizer, it's going to take some time for that to break down. Typically, that's where I would like to see a rotational grazing system in place where you could put the horses or livestock out on a different pasture for a while. Because if you're going to fertilize, you're going to also be waiting for for the pasture to come back in, assuming you mowed it and then went back in with a fertilizer. You're probably going to want to give it some time off. So at minimum, I would say 2 weeks. just so that you can let that break down, kind of go through that environmental process, you know, hoping that you get some rain and heat so the fertilizer can kind of penetrate into the soil profile, and you can kind of give that pasture a head start on growing back.
Awesome. And then there was a more general question. I'm not sure, maybe the person can elaborate, but they were asking, when is the best time to plant? I'm assuming they mean for your more typical grasses.
Yeah, so right now, April, May, depending on your weather conditions and your soil temperatures, if you have a soil thermometer, go out there. If your soils are above 50, then I would say you're good to go. And I really like to see the use of a drill, just so that you have that good seed to soil contact and you can get good establishment. But spring is usually a good time, or, you know, you can do something in midsummer to early fall. Just really depends on your system and how you're managing it.
Awesome, thank you. Anyone else have any additional questions? I think you've answered all our questions, Jodi.
All right, great.
Well, thank you very much. Oh, yes. So Sarah's just asking me to mention that our talk next month will be by Joy Tomlinson, who it turns out is actually a participant on this lecture. And she'll be talking about gastric ulcers next month. So it'll be the second Tuesday of the month. We'll send out another invite. You can find it on Cornell Equine Seminar Series page online. And I think we'll probably be having that talk exclusively on Zoom as well, no in person. But yeah, so if you have any questions about gastric ulcers, come to next month's talk. And thank you very much, Jodi, for sharing all of your knowledge with us.
Thank you, guys. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me or you can text me. A lot of the time right now, since we're in this social distancing type of atmosphere, you can send me pictures via text if you have a weed problem and need help diagnosing what it is. But thank you for your time. And it was great to be able to do this with you guys.
Thanks, Jodi. Take care, everyone. Thanks, guys.
Take care.